We're here today talking about the illicit connection and illicit discharge field screening and source tracing guidance manual. It's a mouthful, but that's the name that we came up with. We started out with just field screening and we expanded that to also include source tracing, indicator sampling, so there's a lot more in there that we didn't initially start out thinking about, but we think it'll be a really useful resource for everyone, so that's what we're here today to talk about. I wanted to start off by introducing, first of all, the staff from Herrera Environmental Consultants that's here today. My name's Rebecca Dugopolski. I'm an environmental engineer at Herrera. I've been there about 7.5 years and working mainly on stormwater issues and a lot with training, a lot with illicit discharges. Today I'm assisted by George Ifner with Herrera and John Lenth, and they'll be helping us out with the team exercise, the demo stations, and also helping you out with the field exercise out in the field. So today what we're going to talk about is becoming familiar with the content of what's in this manual, understanding how to use it, and when you're investigating illicit discharges, what sections can be useful to you. Learn how to use some common field equipment, so those are the demo stations I talked about. Also learning about proper sampling techniques for, and also catch basin manhole inspections, what you should be looking for. So that's just a brief outline of what I touched on already, but we're starting off with the introduction, a little bit of background, and the permit requirements, kind of what is the driver for this project. So I mentioned that we worked on this project with King County, with Jeannie Dorn, and also Doug Novetsky, with the Washington Stormwater Center, Spokane County, so we had a lot of input from Eastern Washington permittees as well, and Herrera, so that's our project team for this. Our funding came from a grant of regional or statewide significance, a gross grant from Ecology, and the goal was to develop an illicit discharge field screening manual that covered the entire state of Washington. So in the past, we've referred to the Center for Watershed Protection manual that was developed on the East Coast, and we thought some things in there weren't necessarily as applicable to Washington, so we wanted to develop something more specific, and that also took into account things we've learned over the years since that manual was written, also take into account local thresholds and techniques. So the intended audience for this manual is permit coordinators, field staff, a wide range of Phase 1, Phase 2, Eastern and Western Washington, also useful for WSDOT, secondary permittees, so a pretty broad audience. So one of the questions we got asked while we were developing the manual is, why do we need another manual? We have lots of manuals out there. We don't really want another regulatory document. So the main reason that we developed this manual is to provide a tool for you to use in your programs. This isn't another regulatory document. It is a guidance manual, so you're welcome to pick and choose pieces of it that seem most applicable to your program. Right now, there's a PDF of the manual posted on the Stormwater Center website, but we're looking at also posting a Word version so you can pick and choose pieces that you can then assemble for your own programs. So hopefully, all the background research that went into this will be useful for you and helping further develop your programs. And also we thought that statewide guidance would be helpful rather than each jurisdiction going out and doing all this research on their own. We know that funding's pretty limited, so hopefully this will be useful for you and the research that went into the manual, and then you can take and adapt that to your own jurisdictions. So here's kind of the path that we went throughout this project. Back in July, we started out with a field screening survey, so some of you may have filled that out. We sent that out to 9 different regional forums. We ended up with 35 responses from Eastern and Western Washington permittees, both Phase 1 and Phase 2s. We even got 1 secondary permittee, which is pretty good. And that gave us input on what methodologies and indicators that people are using in the state. In August through November, we did a literature review, taking a look at 25 different references, so both national and local references, and taking a look at what methodologies and indicators people are using there. And that summary report is available on the Washington Stormwater website if you're interested in taking a look. That document's still available there, and you can take a look at that. In September and November of last year, we went around and did a bunch of presentations to the regional forums, Roadmap and the Eastern Washington Stormwater Coordinators Group. Those are kind of 2 of our key project partners in providing a lot of review and input on the manual, and also a few other meetings as well. In February and March, we had our draft manual out for review, focusing on input from Roadmap and the Eastern Washington group. And then April, we had a public review draft, so we may have received comments from a few of you as well. And here's the final now out. And I mentioned this is on the Stormwater Center website if you want to download The electronic version, that's pretty useful as well. You'll notice there's a lot of blue underlining in here as you flip through, and those are actually all hyperlinks in the electronic version. So it's pretty easy to jump around different sections of the manual from there. So I wanted to start off with a little bit, this is also kind of one of the introduction sections in the manual, talking about the permit requirements, kind of what are some of the drivers for this manual and why is it important. Field screening requirements, these are for Western Washington for phase ones. Just bulleting out, this is table 1 in the manual if you wanted to look at that as well. So implementing a field screening methodology, so that's kind of the reason why we have this upfront section is field screening methodologies. And screening can be conducted according to the Center for Watershed Protection Manual or another methodology of comparable or improved effectiveness. So that's kind of what our manual has, are different methodologies that you can then pick and choose what works best in certain areas of your jurisdiction. Business inspections are required for the phase 1 permit, but are not for the phase 2s, as you'll see in a minute, but they can be useful. There's different field screening thresholds. Right now, the phase 1s are at 12% of the system per year, and phase 2s are kind of ramping up to that level. So there's kind of the second half of the phase 1. And then phase 2, so the field screening requirements, field screening methodologies, and source tracing, the first, second, and fifth, those are all the same as the phase 1 permit. The two areas that differ in the phase 2 permit are business inspections. They're not required, but we've heard that they can be very useful in finding illicit discharges and illicit connections, so that may be something that you want to think about doing in your jurisdiction. A lot of phase 2s do have source control grants where they go out and take a look at small businesses, and they're finding that to be pretty effective. So that's one thing you can consider there. Field screening performance measures I talked about, we're kind of ramping up to the same level that's in the phase 1 permit. So right now the target is 40% of your stormwater drainage system by December 2017, and then ramping up to 12% per year thereafter. Do we have any secondary permittees here today? A couple? Good, okay. One of the comments that we got on the public review draft actually was that it would be helpful to include secondary permittees requirements in there as well. So we added this table 2 to the final manual. And what that includes, here we have the phase 1 permit, the S6D and S6E requirements. So in there, they're focused mainly on outfall inspections, so a little bit narrower than what's now in the phase 1 and phase 2 permit, where it's kind of broadened to all field screening methodologies. So focusing on outfalls for S6D, and then pretty similar to the phase 1 and phase 2 for the S6E requirements. And there's the second slide of that one. And then for phase 2 permittees, secondary permittees, this is pretty similar to the S6D requirements, and for new permittees, they just have a little bit longer until March 2018 to implement the field screening requirements. So next we're going to touch on the permit requirements for Eastern Washington. Starting off with field screening requirements, you have a requirement for field assessment activities, including visual inspections of outfalls or facilities during dry weather. Field screening methodologies are not specified in the permit, but permittees must develop procedures. So you can take a look at the field screening performance measures below. So this manual will be useful for Eastern Washington permittees because you can take a look at the methodologies that are in there and pick the ones that work the best for you. Even though you don't have a requirement to select a methodology, you do have a requirement to develop procedures. Business inspections are not specified in the permit, but permittees can use business inspections for meeting the field screening performance measures. And this is the same in Eastern and Western Washington. The performance measures is field screening at least 40% of your storm drainage system no later than December 31st, 2018. So you have an extra year in Eastern Washington compared to Western, and on average 12% each year thereafter. And then also for source tracing, procedures for tracing the source of illicit discharge, that's also a requirement in the permit. So those are the requirements for phase 2 permittees in Eastern Washington. For secondary permittees, the requirements are a little bit different, focusing specifically on outfalls and not so much on the methodology approach. Field screening methodology is again the same. It's not specified in the permit, but you must develop procedures. Business inspections, again, not specified in the permit, but something that could be useful to secondary permittees as well. Field screening performance measures, instead of the 40% and then the 12% of the system, it's 1/3 of your outfalls each year, beginning in August 2016 for current secondary permittees or March 2019 for new secondary permittees. And again, source tracing fairly similar, just implement procedures to identify and remove illicit discharges. So that's just a summary of the permit requirements. Definitely take a look at your permits for more details. And if you have any questions, following up with Ecology on what those requirements are. Any questions on permit requirements? So it's a pretty broad summary that's in the manual. Obviously, refer to your permit for more detail, but we kind of just wanted to summarize a few of the drivers and a few of the main background reasons behind what we've included in the manual. So next, we'll move into talking about the manual structure and content. Starting off with the outline. So as I mentioned before, the introduction, it's just a page on the background, a little bit about the scope of the manual, and then talking about how the manual is organized. Section 2, we kind of touched on a little bit. There's definitions and acronyms, and then those Table 1 and Table 2, where I summarize the regulatory requirements. Sections 3, 4, and 5 are really the meat of the manual. So starting off with field screening methodologies, moving next into indicators, and then section 5 is the source tracing methodologies. And then there's some pretty useful information in the appendices as well. So we'll run through what a few of those contain. So starting off, since we touched on, section 1 to section 2 are kind of the introduction to the manual. Section 3 really gets into selecting a field screening methodology. So this has a flow chart, kind of the first 11 by 17 pullout here. Flow chart, which is pretty useful. Talks about the different field screening methodologies you can use for either pipe or ditch systems. And then if flow is present, moving next into indicator sampling. And then shifting next into source tracing. Mainly, if you have access to the property, things like that, what methodologies would be the most useful there. There's also a section on general guidelines for data management, safety considerations, and a reference to the cost appendix. So that's a pretty general section, but pretty useful to read through, and some of that information might be useful to you as well. Then moving next into the methodologies. We ended up with 6 total field screening methodologies: business inspections, catch basin manhole inspections, ditch inspections, outfall inspections, stormwater BMP inspections, and video inspections. And then you'll notice here this placeholder at the end for other field screening methodologies, and what that contains are just a few other methodologies that we didn't have time to delve into further. You'll notice in the indicators section there's quite a list of indicators there. We wanted to focus on what would be most useful to you in your programs, so that's why we selected these 6, but there are others you could take a look at as well. So I touched a little bit on this flow chart, so definitely take a look at that 11 by 17 pullout. It's a little bit easier to see there than on this slide. But walk through kind of what that contains for pipe systems on the left and ditch systems on the right. And moving from field screening methodologies to source tracing. So you'll notice there are some methodologies that are considered both field screening and source tracing. So here's just a summary of the 6 that are field screening. 4 of those are also source tracing. And what we decided to do, instead of having you jump back and forth through the manual, those are actually duplicated in the source tracing methodology section, but modified. So for the process you would go through for source tracing compared to field screening. So we added some headers on there so you know which section you're in. So make sure you take a look at the top and make sure you know if you're in field screening or source tracing, because the methods are slightly different in both sections. So next I wanted to step through an example. So if you want to follow along, the one I selected is on page 21. It's catch basin manhole inspections. So each section is laid out in a similar format. So once you're familiar with the format, it's pretty easy to step through the manual. There's a couple different things in the indicator section, but both the field screening and source tracing layout is the same. It starts out with a description, which basically defines what the methodology is. There's this chart in the middle that's applications, so the storm drainage system type, whether it's applicable to pipe systems, ditch systems, small or large drainage areas. And then the column on the right is land use types. So you'll notice some of them are applicable to all land uses. Some are a little more specific. So you can take a look at that when deciding what methodology to use in certain areas. As I mentioned before, you definitely have some parts of your system that are piped and some that are ditch systems. So you may be using different methodologies in different portions of your jurisdiction. Next, we have an equipment list, and here we have checkboxes. So once we have the Word file available, hopefully that'll be easy for you to pick and choose what equipment you need, and then you can use that for your field crews to go through and make sure they have all the equipment they need for different methodologies. The next page steps through the methods. So this is written in a standard operating procedure SOP format. So it steps through the different steps and things you should consider when implementing that methodology. Next, we have pros and cons. So here we've summarized, some good things about the method and some bad things. Every method has its pros and cons, so you'll need to weigh that when deciding which to select. But hopefully that'll help you, decide what is the benefit and what are some of the risks with that particular methodology. And then here are some of those blue hyperlinks that I mentioned earlier. So this, in the electronic version, you can easily skip to these different sections. So here we have primary field screening indicators, follow-up indicators, and I'll talk about what those mean in a minute, and then skipping to other field screening methodologies. So hopefully that'll help you navigate around the manual a little bit better in the electronic version. So any questions on the section 3 on the methodologies? I'm going to have no questions today because no one wants to be on video, I guess. So, but feel free to pipe up and ask questions throughout the presentation. And follow up afterwards as well. We'll be floating around throughout the training if you have questions. So next I wanted to step through the indicator section because there are some differences between this and the methodologies section. Here we have two different flowcharts in this section 4. One flowchart is focusing on rural land use and one flowchart is focusing on urban land use, and I'll talk about those in a minute. In the general guidelines, there's a couple additional sections. So again, we have safety considerations and reference to the cost appendix. We also have a section on field quality assurance and quality control and lab analysis quality assurance, quality control. And John will be touching on a little bit of that when you're outside in the field later about what you should do in terms of some QA, QC. And then we have the indicator pullout sections. Here we have the first 8 parameters listed there. And continuing through number 15. So we ended up with 15 different indicators. It was kind of hard to whittle down this list to those 15, but those are the 15 we think will be the most useful to you in your programs. And in a minute, I'll show you that we split them up into primary field screening and follow-up indicators. So there's some that are easier to collect and faster, and then some that take some additional analysis and follow-up. So we kind of split those into 2 different groups. And then, as I mentioned previously, there's this other indicators section. And there's quite a laundry list at the end of this section that includes a bunch of other different parameters that can be very useful if you just have an unusual discharge that you can't quite figure out. There's some hints there on what might be useful in certain situations, but definitely some more specialized indicators that may or may not always be used for illicit discharges, but could be useful in certain situations. So I touched on these 2 figures, figure 2 and figure 3. Figure 2 walks you through an urban land use setting, and figure 3 steps you through a rural land use setting. You'll notice the rural land use is a little bit simpler than urban one's a little more complicated. But starting off at the top, what we have there in that box are our primary field screening indicators and a list of thresholds you should be taking a look at. The way that we selected those were some pretty quick and easy things to do in the field that would then clue you into an issue that you would need to follow up on. We wanted to make sure we didn't include things that required lab analysis up in that upfront box, so things like fecal coliform come later on the chart. These blue boxes are land use. The purple ones are a potential source. And these orange ones I wanted to touch on a little bit. You may think we just kind of stop there. It's really hard to make a flowchart for illicit discharges, so that's one where we ended up on, if you're not finding any of these, standard sources, it may just be something you have to do a lot more investigation, possibly use that list of indicators at the end of the section that require some additional follow-up analysis. So that's kind of what that orange is. More follow-up is needed, some additional sampling, land use characterization, things like that. And then one of the other comments we got is that was kind of a top-down process with the flow charts. And some people told us, well, we already know what it is. We just need to verify, what the source is. So this table 4 basically lays out if you suspect it's sanitary wastewater, for example, here are some indicators you can take a look at, and here are some follow-up indicators. So it's kind of the two different processes that people go through, both the top-down and the bottom-up approach. So hopefully, one of those two will work for you. This one will definitely work if you've worked a lot with illicit discharges and you already know what some of the indicators are. If you need to kind of verify what that is, here are some thresholds and things to look at there. So I touched a little on the primary and follow-up, and this just kind of summarizes those. I mentioned that the primary, we tried to pick indicators that were pretty easy and quick to do in the field. So that's something, if you see flow, you can test for these things pretty quickly. You'll notice that a few of them are just visual observations. So things like color, visual indicators, those are pretty quick and easy to record on your field sheet. pH and temperature, if you have a pH meter, you can get both of those at the same time. You can also use a simple thermometer and pH test strips, which we have here today. Turbidity can either be using a turbidity meter or just visual observations. And ammonia is also pretty easy with test strips. So that list is kind of what we came up with, something that's quick and easy to do out in the field, and something that can be done on the samples that you collect when you see flow. Follow-up indicators, are things that take a little bit more time, are a little more specialized depending on what kind of source you suspect. And also fecal coliform bacteria, that's something that needs to be sent to the lab and take some time. So we tried not to put something in the primary list that then you'd have to stop and wait for results. So the primary lists are things that are fast and easy to do in the field, and then follow-up are looking at particular sources. So that's kind of what those two flow charts and also that table kind of step you through that process of selecting. So next we'll step through the pH section, which is on page 81, if you want to flip ahead and follow along. And you'll notice this is up front, this is a pretty similar layout to what's in the methodologies section. Starting off again with the description, this time what the indicator is, so what is pH. Applications, what storm drain system types, what land use types is applicable. Equipment checklist, so here's one where it refers you back to the field screening methodology. And the reason why we did that is we didn't want to list every type of equipment under each of the indicators. So make sure you take a look at the methodology you're using and also the particular indicator you're using. And there are things here listed like pH meter or pH test strips, so we kept that flexible depending on which route your jurisdiction wants to go, which type of equipment you select. The methods section is a little bit longer typically just because we went through the methods for each type of thing you could use. So the pH field meter, we stepped through some basic steps there. pH test strips, we stepped through those. One thing I wanted to point out is that we kept these pretty generic because every field meter and every bottle of test strips is slightly different. So you want to take a look at your meter, your test strip, and the instructions that came with that to make sure you're waiting the right amount of time for the test strips, that you're calibrating your meter correctly, pushing the right buttons. So we put some basic guidance on there on what you should be doing with basically every pH field meter. So making sure you calibrate and what you should be doing there. So, but also take a look at your particular field meter and make sure you're following those steps as well. Next is a section that wasn't included in the methodology section, and this is thresholds. And within thresholds, we have, if there is a water quality standard, we've included that, and also a threshold for follow-up sampling. And those were the thresholds that were listed on Figure 2 and Figure 3. And for a pH, you'll notice that it's a little bit broader than the water quality standards. And the reason for that is when you're looking for illicit discharges, you're looking for something that's either really low or really high. So in pH, we're looking something that's less than 5 or greater than 9. And so the water quality standards are a little bit narrower, but for illicit discharges, we wanted to get kind of those extremes. And most of the thresholds, there aren't two. For pH, there's a low and a high, but most of the indicators, it's just above a certain level that you need to follow up on. Again, pros and cons, both with the indicator and also with the different types of equipment. So here you can see, a pro, The test strips are inexpensive and easy to use, but the meters can be more accurate than test strips. So kind of you have to weigh those things when deciding what to use for your program. But hopefully that's some good guidance there to help you make those decisions. Next is another section that wasn't included in the methodology section, and this section is hopefully pretty useful to you in your programs. This is what we called sources, and so for pH, we have both sources of low pH and sources of high pH, and this was compiled from the different literature resources we looked at, and also some additional feedback we got from the draft manuals. So hopefully this is useful to you if you have a low pH situation, you're trying to figure out what's going on, taking a look at the industry and land use within the basin. Perhaps dairy products can cause low pH. Maybe there's a dairy industry within the basin, textile mills, wineries, things you can look at in terms of low pH. And also high pH, there's a list there. So hopefully those will help you a little bit in determining taking a look at your basin and what some of the potential sources might be. And again, we have the references to other sections. So again, these are hyperlinked in the electronic version, but also useful in the pull-out versions that you take out in the field. So a list there of other sections that could be helpful. And any questions on the basic structure before we talk a little bit about thresholds? Silence. OK. So I touched a little bit on pH, what we came up with for the threshold, but here are the other thresholds for the primary field screening indicators. Those are also listed in that top box on Figure 2 and Figure 3. And these were developed based on the literature review and also the survey results that we got. So what other jurisdictions are using. We took a look at a wide variety of sources. We'll actually be putting together a memorandum that will summarize this as well, talking about how we came up with these thresholds. So that's the list for primary field screening indicators. You can see some of them are pretty easy. If you have color, that's pretty easy. If you have odor, other visual indicators. For the follow-up indicators, these were a little bit trickier, but we had a lot of good resources to develop those. So here are the different thresholds we came up with. We've had some questions about fecal coliform bacteria, why we have 2 thresholds. And the reason for that is in dry weather, you want to be looking at basically what's coming out. Dry weather, you'll have a lower level if you have a sewage source. In wet weather, you'll have a variety of different sources that are also coming into play. So we wanted to make sure with that 500 CFU per 100 milliliters that we weren't triggering that threshold every time in wet weather, because it's pretty easy to get 500 in wet weather sampling. So that's the reason for the 5,000 is that during wet weather, you have all these other sources in your basin, and you want to make sure that you're really looking for those illicit connections and sewage sources. So that was the reason for those 2 different thresholds there. Any other questions on thresholds? OK. So next, I just wanted to step quickly through source tracing. We're not going to go into detail in terms of the layout of the section, because as I mentioned before, it's very similar to the field screening methodology section. Again, it refers you back to that Figure 1 that we looked at the beginning. Again, we have data management recommendations, safety considerations, and a reference to the cost appendix. Here we have a longer list of methodologies. So here's the first 6. And then we have 10 total source tracing methodologies. And then again, at the end, we have a list of a few other source tracing methodologies that might be useful to look at in certain situations. So any questions on the meat of the manual before I get into the appendices? Again, silence. All right. Quiet crowd this morning. Sorry for the early start. We wanted to make sure we got everything in before lunch so we could let you go before lunch. So that was the reason for starting at 8:30, but we have a lot of fun stuff to cover today. So thanks for getting here early. Hopefully coffee and things in the back was helpful to you. So next I'm going to touch briefly on what's in some of the appendices, starting off with the cost appendix. And you'll notice that this is a preliminary assessment of equipment vendors and supplies. It's for informational purposes only. Obviously, it'd be a whole nother gross grant project if we were to develop a full cost appendix with all the different vendors and suppliers there are out there. So So just that disclaimer that this isn't an exhaustive list of potential vendors, just some that we came up with quickly as references for you to take a look at when researching field meters and test kits. We also didn't include standard items, so there's a list at the beginning of Appendix A that talks about a few things that we didn't include that we think, are things that you already probably have with your field crews and with your stormwater programs already. So there are 4 different tables, and they contain either the methodology or indicator name, quantity or description of the item, a range of equipment costs. So for some of the meters we were looking at, we looked at kind of from the low end to the high end. There probably are some that are higher as well. We just took a ballpark of the average values there. Vendor names and a link to the vendor website. And then also we included, after those 4 tables, there's a section that talks about different tiers. So what we did is we took a look at, what would be some typical things you would have in just kind of a basic, or what we're calling a minimum level field screening program. And so for what we're thinking for this minimum level is you would include all of those primary field screening indicators, those ones that are at the top of Figure 2 and Figure 3, and that you'd be taking a look at turbidity through visual observations only, because definitely that turbidity meter will drive up your cost. One follow-up indicator, detergent surfactants, we think is pretty useful, and one source tracing technique, dye testing. And so for that kind of base level program, what we came up with in terms of cost was about $1,000 to $1,600. So not too bad for a basic level program. That's something that's pretty easy to go to your city county councils with and get approval for some of these equipment costs if you don't have them already. One thing we wanted to point out is that some of those things like ammonia, those come in a bottle of 25 test strips, so you may want to project out how many samples you will be collecting and up that cost a little bit. This also doesn't include labor, it's just equipment costs. For the intermediate level, again, we're looking at the primary field screening indicators, but here we bumped up the turbidity to a turbidity meter. That's something that's also useful in other programs, construction inspections, things like that, so that could be a pretty useful piece of equipment to have. 2 follow-up indicators, detergent surfactants again, and adding potassium, so you could take a look at the ratio of ammonia to potassium. That can be useful. And 3 different source tracing techniques. So for that, approximate equipment cost ranges from $2,600 to $6,300. So again, not too bad, still under $10,000. You may have to do some tweaks looking at number of samples, but not too bad. And then the advanced level. So once you kick in video inspections, you'll notice your costs go way, way up. So primary field screening indicators. For this level, we have a turbidity meter and also a multimeter for some of the other parameters. We have multiple follow-up indicators. Again, 3 source tracing techniques, but adding video inspections. And you'll see here that this cost is quite variable depending on what type of video inspection you use. So if you're using just a pole camera, kind of on the low end of the range, $1,700 or $17,000, and on the upper end, if you're getting a full video rig, that can be close to $500,000 for all that equipment. So hopefully just some ballpark costs for you to start with. Feel free to tweak the numbers that are in those tables and take what works best for you in your programs. But if you're needing more equipment to support these new field screening requirements, hopefully this will be useful to you. Any questions on costs? Okay. Appendix B contains some example field forms that we got from a variety of jurisdictions and other sources. I know a lot of you have already developed an outfall inspection form as part of your current programs. There are a few examples there. We also included some sources, some forms for dye testing, optical brightener monitoring, septic system inspections, smoke testing, and general indicator sampling. So we'll post the Word and Excel versions that we have of those forms. Feel free to tweak them for your jurisdiction, but hopefully it's just some basic guidance of how you would set up recording some information for those different methodologies. Appendix C was kind of a fun one to put together. We got a variety of different case studies from different jurisdictions. So thanks to cities of Bellevue, King County, Federal Way, Bothell, and Seattle for supplying their stories and photos for us to include in the manual. So you'll see we have 10 different case studies there that cover a wide range of situations. So some pretty interesting things to read through and take a look at what's been found in other jurisdictions and how they found it. And then Appendix D, I wasn't going to go into much detail on. It's just a list of other resources and also hyperlinks to other websites. Hopefully those won't get outdated too quickly, but at least you have the full names of those manuals and resources, so you can hopefully find those in the future if they move around on the internet. And that's kind of my manual summary in a nutshell. So a little bit fast, but hopefully a good idea of what's in there. You know, feel free to skim through the manual later. Shoot me an email if you have any questions, but that's what we came up with in terms of our literature review and survey, and hopefully a pretty usable format where you can pull out. The intent was to be able to just pull out those different sections. If you say, I want to look at pH, you can just pull that section straight out of the manual. So that's the intent and how we set things up. So before we shift gears, any questions on the manual? All right, I explained it all very well. Excellent.